What is it we do when we work, rest, play? These things that take up so much of our lives. But what if there's a different question? Not about what we are doing, but rather, what are we looking for when we work, rest, play? Are we hoping that what we do, how we relax, or the hobbies we choose will somehow bring us the identity, purpose, and meaning we've been searching for? Are the true religions of our time work, rest, play?
So we are landing our work, rest, and play series this morning. What I've been trying to do throughout this series is curate a sort of cross-section of ideas that will hopefully help us think about the perspectives that we often take on the stuff that we do with our lives. So last week, we considered how paying attention to the creation story helps us to develop a more biblical perspective on work. And essentially, in that perspective being that work is essential to, it's essential and central to biblical imagination. However, what we sort of tried to identify was that there's a disordered nature to humanity that results in humans almost always having unhealthy relationships with our work. And particularly this is in relation to the status that we attempt to draw from the work that we do. Now what this does is it often leads us to busyness and overwhelm that we kind of find ourselves trapped in an attempt to sort of quote unquote make the grade. And maybe there's even a sentence that you can relate to that sometimes our busyness and our overwhelm that we encounter, like what is beneath that? If you've ever been in the situation where attempting to achieve something, meet something, or make some particular level in your working life is eating into the rest of your life, then you probably relate to this notion that we're sort of somehow out of sync with what God's designed us for and how creation imagines that we'll do things. However, I want to kind of return very briefly to the creation story this morning because I think that within the creation narrative is a foil of sorts to this human tendency towards working ourselves too much. It's a very subtle and very simple moment in the creation story that I hope kind of ties both sides of what the Bible's doing with humans together. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 1, 2, and 3, we see this text here. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Listen to the repetition in that paragraph. There's probably a word that you're kind of just going to hear more dominantly in there. This constant repetition of the seventh day. 7, this Hebrew number that kind of literally translates as the notion of completeness or finishedness or kind of doneness at some level. Jewish people refer to this seventh day in a word that sounds very similar to the Hebrew word for seventh. They call it Shabbat. Sabbath, as we often refer to it in English. On the seventh day, God makes Sabbath the day of rest. So we get this sort of fascinating little story that at the end of God's creative process, he rests from what he is doing. And this becomes formative for the Old Testament, for the Hebrew Bible, for Jewish people, and ultimately becomes formative for Christian tradition as well. This notion that at the end of 6 days of work, we should rest. So it's not simply that Jewish people read this story of God and said, oh, that's nice for God, but this becomes formative for how we find the rhythm of our own lives. But I want you to notice something about how this seventh day is described. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. The Hebrew word for holy is the word kadosh. I feel like we should say that together. Kadosh. It's the noise a rock makes when it hits water. That's the sort of emphasis you're wanting in that particular word. And the word literally translates as heavy, We translate it often in English as holy, but the word means weighty. It means heavy. It means dense. There's something about holiness in the Jewish imagination that there's something about it. It's got a weightiness to it. And this is the word, this density or weightiness is the word that they use to describe the sort of majesty and also the mystery of God. If you want to talk about God in all of his splendor, if you want to talk about the majesty of God, the mystery of God, you're probably going to say it's heavy, there's a lot to it. It's got some density to it. But notice this. God blessed the seventh day. He blessed the Sabbath, the day of rest, and made it holy. Nothing in the whole creation story has until this point been called holy, except for this day of rest. Nothing else has been described in that way. The word holy hasn't been used in this particular context before. So none of the space, when God made light and darkness, this was not described as holy. When God made mountains and valleys or land and sea, none of this was described as holy. When God made humans in his image, they weren't described as holy. The first time something is described as holy in this creation, it's time. It's a piece of time, a portion of time, and a time in which we should rest. The first and only thing that represents the mystery and majesty of God in the creation story is doing nothing. The brilliant Jewish rabbi and author Abraham Joshua Heschel describes Sabbath in this quite brilliant way. He says, the meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week, we live under the tyranny of things of space. On the Sabbath, we try to become attuned to the holiness in time. It is a day on which we are called upon to share in what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world. So God calls a piece of time holy. Notice, unlike most religions of the world, and this is where we see the kind of alternate nature of the biblical faith, is that rather than a space being holy, now often that's when we talk about holiness, we think about spaces being holy. In fact, even in Christian tradition, you'll often find them refer to the space in which the Christians meet on a Sunday as the sanctuary. Have you ever heard that term used? And sanctuary literally comes through the Latin. It means the holy space. I mean, we meet in an old curling rink, so I'm not quite sure. There's probably some stuff that's happened in this room that probably means we can never call it holy space, right? Some of you were there, right? But we often think of space as holy, or if we're really quite kind of with it, we'll think of space and we'll think of people as holy. We'll think, oh, there's a holy people, and you see holy spaces in the Bible, and you see holy people in the Bible. But before all of that, this notion that rest and time can be holy. So maybe if we think about what Heschel is wrestling with in this particular thought, we can realize that Sabbath is an invitation, because it allows us to step beyond the performancism that takes over so much of our lives. Our lives are so often ruled and governed by what we're producing and how we're doing at that, by how well are we producing the things that we say we're supposed to produce. Notice how Heschel phrases this, that we move from results to mystery. So much of my life is, if I allow it to be, governed by the results of what I do. And here God takes a day and says there should be no results on that day. There should be no produce on that day. There should be nothing done in that day. So this gives us clarity when we think about Sabbath. The Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says that this actually gives us clarity on who God is. And he points out three things that we can tell about God simply from observing God's creation of Sabbath. The first thing we can learn about God from Sabbath is this: he is not a workaholic. So when you're looking to God to defend your working strategy, be careful, because this God is not a workaholic. This God can stop. This God can step away. The second thing you notice in this passage is that God is not anxious about the full functioning of his creation. Now, some of us are really bad at resting. We're always there. We're always in the office. We're always doing the thing. We're always in touch. We're on demand, like we are there and ready. Some of us are a little more, kind of evolved, so we can take time off. We can go home. But you know the type of person that claims to be resting, but they're not really? You know that person, their phone is always present. Because they know at any one moment, the morons back at work are going to make a mess. And they're going to need super person me to swoop in and save the day with the right email or the right phone call. Or I have an app that allows me to be at work when I'm not at work. So I can be on the beach and working. What kind of fresh hell is that? But God doesn't do this. God leaves creation. He says, I'm done. He says, it's finished. And he allows it to continue working. The sun is rising. The stars are doing their thing. The earth is revolving. The plants are growing. The fish are swimming. And what's God doing? He's resting because he trusts the way that it is. And there we see perhaps the third thing about what we learn about God in Sabbath is that the well-being of creation does not depend on endless work. That there is a time to pause, that there is a time to rest, that there is a time to breathe out, because creation doesn't need to always be working. So if that's true of God, what might Sabbath then say about me? What might Sabbath say to us? Well, in a later passage in the early chapters, in the early pages rather of the Old Testament, we find another book called Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, we encounter a telling of the story of the Ten Commandments. Now, Deuteronomy's telling of the story of the Ten Commandments varies ever so slightly from Exodus's telling of the Ten Commandments. And particularly it varies when it comes to a comment about the fourth commandment, which relates to Sabbath. In Deuteronomy's account, right at the end of the fourth commandment, this new line appears that we haven't seen before. And after we have been told that we must observe the Sabbath, that we must keep the Sabbath, that we must hold that day as different, the text says this: remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now just hold that story for a moment. In our history, we have seen at several points moments where the ugly aspect of humanity has enslaved people. And unfortunately, it's a repeating story that we see cycling on a regular basis of humans enslaving other humans. And in other points, perhaps fortunately, we've been able to see that tyranny oppressed and pushed back for certain periods of time and people released from slavery. We find ourselves thinking, what would you say to people who were released from slavery? I grew up in Sierra Leone in West Africa. I spent most of my formative years there. And the capital city of Sierra Leone is a town called Freetown. And the reason it's called Freetown is because after the abolition of slavery in Europe, a lot of the previous people who were slaves, it was decided that they should be sent back to West Africa. Now, this in and of itself was a human rights violation because many of these people were several generations European, and just dropping them all off in one part of West Africa wasn't the solution to the problem either, but it's what happened. And these boats sailed into this port in Freetown, and these slaves were unloaded, and there was this one tree that happened to stand there. And basically what was told to these slaves was, once you have walked past that tree, you are free. And so as these slaves walked up the harbor and then in through and past this tree, they found themselves free. The tree's still there. It's called the Freedom Tree. It's there in the middle of the city, in this bustle of this busy sort of city that's going on. You find this old tree stood there. This significant moment in the history of that country and perhaps in the history of the world. But think about what it would be like to walk past that tree. What might you say if you were there? How might you talk to people who had just been freed? And so here we have this moment where God talks to a group of slaves who have just been freed. He has just freed them. And the thing he says to them is, now that you're free, you should take a day off. Now, without being insensitive, Is that what you would say to someone who had just been freed from a lifetime of being someone else's property, from a lifetime of being abused and oppressed and downtrodden? Like maybe you would think, I'll take a week off, thank you very much, or even a month. But you should take a day off. Now, some scholars have observed to us this truth about the human, which is found in the Exodus story. That God's real difficulty in the Exodus story wasn't getting the Israelites out of Egypt. It was getting Egypt out of the Israelites. Because in generations and generations of slavery, they started to think and behave as if their value was only found in what they produced. Here's a group of people who only produce things. If they don't produce things, they're worthless to their owners. So their productivity is their value. And God is reprogramming them from slavery into freedom. And he reminds them of Sabbath. He reminds them that this God is not a workaholic, and therefore he won't demand they be workaholics also. More deeply, he's saying to them that their value is not found in what they produce. And you see, this is a common theme in the Old Testament that echoes throughout history, that the Old Testament seems to be aware of the fact that humans are always under threat of slavery. There's the big, ugly types of slavery that we see and we learn about throughout history, and our history is ugly on that front. And this doesn't go away. It seems that humans perpetuate this sort of cycle of abuse. But then there's other types of slavery as well, which are far more subtle. The kind of less obvious kind of slavery that easily affects all of us. The type of slavery where you work these insane hours, and when asked, why are you working these hours? You say, because I want to buy my dream house. And you buy your dream house, but because of how many hours you work, you never spend any time in this dream house because you're always trying to earn the money in order to own it. That type of slavery is also, in the biblical imagination, not good for you. But as Christians, you see, we don't live in this law of Sabbath that we see rolled out in the Old Testament. Jesus has to speak quite specifically to that, to say that actually when you turn this command to rest, when you turn this command which is designed to reprogram you from thinking of yourself purely as a production mechanism, you can turn that into a law and lose what it's all about. But sometimes I think what's happened in contemporary Christianity is we found the freedom from the law of Sabbath, but we haven't learned the place for the grace of rest, for the ability to rest in the grace of God. Brueggemann continues it like this. He says, in our own contemporary context of the rat race of anxiety, the celebration of Sabbath is an act of both resistance and alternative. It is resistance because it is a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumption of commodity goods. The alternative on offer is the awareness and practice of the claim that we are situated on the receiving end of the gifts of God. Sabbath, rest, if you will let it, will resist the call for more, of always pushing yourself towards another step on the ladder, another achievement that will give you the status that you want. And in its place, Sabbath offers you grace, the grace to rest. The creation story tells us that we are shaped and built to work, but the creation story also tells us that's not all you are. So Sabbath perhaps is where we learn that we can live without work for a day. And perhaps it's where we learn that the world can live without us. In one of his earlier books, Rob Bell lists his thoughts about Sabbath in what I find to be a really helpful way. He says this: Sabbath is taking a day a week to remind myself that I did not make the world and that it will continue to exist without my efforts. Sabbath is a day when my work is done, even if it isn't. Sabbath is a day when my job is to enjoy, period. Sabbath is a day when I am fully available to myself and those I love most. Sabbath is a day when I remember that when God made the world, he saw that it was good. Sabbath is a day when I produce nothing. Sabbath is a day when I remind myself that I am not a machine. Sabbath is a day when at the end I say, I didn't do anything today, and I don't add, and I feel so guilty. Sabbath is a day when my phone is turned off. I don't check my email, and you can't get hold of me. Get a little bit uncomfortable. Just a little bit awkward. Like, is that possible? Can we live like that? Because I think there's a desire within us to be always on, to be living in a kind of on-demand culture where not only do I get what I want when I want it, but people can get me when they want it. And we can blame society, and that's socially acceptable. We say, oh, the crazy culture that we live in these days that pushes us to live this way. But if we were to be honest, is it really society that's pushing us that way? Or is society that way because that's what's in us? There's a desire somehow to be in us. Perhaps it's a sort of paradoxical drive in which we want to be in control, but we also find ourselves leading ourselves into ever more creative standards of slavery. And we want both. And as a result, we end up kind of lost and caught in the middle of it. Now and this is perhaps a huge if we're going to resist that self-destructive desire, perhaps we need to lean back into the fourth commandment again and learn the value and the grace of rest. You see, God says, be still and know that I am God. You notice the text doesn't say, while driving on the highway, eating your takeout food, answering your emails while on speakerphone, you will know that I am God. That might be how you meet God. But where's the stillness? Where's the stillness and the quiet where we find out who God really is and we hear his grace? So perhaps here's a question for you. Why don't you take some rest? Now, if you're like most people, there's probably a list of excuses forming very, very quickly in your mind. They almost effortlessly. The reason I can't take any rest right now is because of what's going on right now in my life. There's a burgeoning list of to-do items stuck to my fridge. And we find ourselves caught up in the sense of, well, yeah, I am busy right now, but it's just the season that I'm in. And just like you can't answer this publicly, but how long has that season been? A decade is not a season. And where's the end of this season? Can you see when it finishes? Because it's a really good way to excuse the pressure that we find ourselves in. But if you can't see the end of the season, maybe it's not a season. Maybe it's your life. Maybe it's how you're now choosing to live. And it's not easy to take rest, right? Like we know that as contemporary people. Perhaps as a question to ask yourself is, what does rest even look like for you? Like, what is rest? Like, is it doing, or perhaps maybe let's change that, is it producing nothing? Is rest silence? Because we're all really good at coping with silence. Or perhaps our rest is what we do with our leisure. Like, is our rest when perhaps we do what we choose to do? Perhaps it's where we do something creative or imaginative, or maybe it's just when we do something that's not stressed, right? It's just something that doesn't carry all of those things that work often has attached to it. It's something that we do because we want to do it. Or maybe rest and leisure is just something that you don't have to do. It's something that's not work, something that doesn't perform or produce. And we've ended up in a context, and perhaps you've noticed this with me, that our context nowadays has become such that our leisure, like our playtime, is increasingly resembling work. Like the things we do with our free time, to people in our history, they would call that a job. Right? They would call that that looks like career, the investment you've got going on in there. Now, and I realize this won't apply to everybody in the room, but I think observationally, you'll be able to track it with me. I think this is most obvious in our context in how we treat our children. I think our perspectives on rest and leisure are damaged, and I think how we treat our children exemplifies this. The so-called extracurricular activity is outweighing pretty much everything else that kids do nowadays. Like, what class are they in, and what camp are they going to, and what program have you signed them up to? You know, like, why are we so scared of our children being bored? Like, as parents, we're terrified of this. Like what will happen to them? Probably they'll become drug dealers if we don't fill every waking moment of their life with something. Why are we scared of them having free time? Why are we scared of them resting? Madeline Levine, in her book, Teach Your Children Well, the cost of this relentless drive to perform at unrealistically high levels is a generation of kids who resemble nothing so much as trauma victims. Now, according to Levine, the results of this are ever-increasing levels of anxiety in our young people, increasing levels of depression, self-medication through drugs and alcohol, difficulty sleeping, and overwhelming fear of failure. Like, it's okay to do nothing. It's okay for your kids to have some board space. It's okay for sometimes us just to breathe and rest. In 2014, the United States CDC recategorized insomnia as an epidemic in the country. That we're so cramming our lives full, both for our children and for ourselves, that sleep is something that we find difficult to do. So when our leisure is invaded by law and not grace, it becomes a curriculum for the general populace that determines whether or not we're making the grade. Are your kids at the level they're supposed to be at? Are you as a parent at the level that you're supposed to be with those kids? Or another way to put it is this: do you only do the things that you do in your rest time because of their benefits and byproducts? Now and you'll notice this often in contemporary conversation. So chat to somebody about what they do with their leisure. And just in your head, count how long it takes them between talking about their leisure and justifying it to you, right? So, and I use that theological word justifying on purpose there, right? So I do this in my leisure time. You know, I jump off mountains and, parachute to the bottom, right? Very rarely will you hear that just as a comment from someone. Then they'll say, I find it really clears my head so that I can work much better that week. Do you know what? That's not leisure. It's now just a strategy to improve my work. It's not rest. God doesn't say take Sabbath because you're really going to ace it in 6 days' time. God says take Sabbath because you are valuable even when you produce nothing. And what we so often do in contemporary context is all of our leisure time must speak into something beneficial rather than just doing it because you enjoy it. If somebody discovers at one point that if you put a 3-year-old in a yoga class, they do much better in grade 1, all of a sudden we're all putting kids in relaxation classes in for yoga, right? It's got nothing to do with whether they need to relax. It's about what they're going to produce as a result of it all. So perhaps we say it like this: rest isn't homework. In an article that was published just last month titled, "When Did Pop Culture Become Homework?" Soraya Roberts observes that this impact, the kind of impact that achievement culture has had on our leisure. Now you can Google the article and read it. She is talking about particularly art, but I think her work has wider impact on us in the contemporary life. That increasingly the stuff that we do in leisure time sort of feels like homework. It feels like I've got to do it. Our leisure has become as much work as our work. Like, we have apps that shout at you if you miss a workout. Like, we literally pay our phones money. I assume there's a person behind the phone somewhere, but I like to think of it in simple terms. We pay our phones money so they will shout at us for not doing something. I mean, don't you have a boss for that? If you don't sleep enough, there's an app that will tell you you're not sleeping enough. You used to have kind of 6 to 8 hours of kind of freedom to kind of just close your eyes, but now it's being assessed. Is your sleep as good as your neighbor's sleep? And what if you dare to miss a workout session at the gym with your friends? Like, walk into a local bookstore if it's not closed down on you, and you'll find endless shelves of books that are telling you how to best understand your life, how to best make the most of your life. And then they'll probably tell you there's a class that you can go to really max out your life as well. Netflix is constantly giving you homework. Hey, by the way, there's a new season of that show that you wanted to watch. And if you don't watch all 12 episodes now, you're going to get a lot of spoilers tomorrow at work. So we all turn up at work tired because our new show came out and we've kind of binge watched it. Leisure has become a chore to many of us. So let me make a public confession just to try and help us with this. I don't like to use my own life as the example, but here goes anyway. I haven't yet seen the latest Avengers movie. Okay? In my office, okay, that doesn't go down well, okay? Have you ever openly confessed that to someone? Have you seen the latest movie? It's 3 hours long, okay? So maybe you have other things to do, but it's worse than that. You know what? I've never yet actually seen an episode of Game of Thrones either. Now, quick spoiler, okay? I think everybody dies. And for those of you that have watched a lot of Game of Thrones and are kind of feeling a little doomed about what happens next week, we do have some excellent grief counseling services here at church. I never ever actually got around to watching Breaking Bad. I watched the UK version. It was a commercial. It just said, "Healthcare is free, don't worry." I never read the Harry Potter books. I only saw like a few of the movies. And I realized that this is really controversial for a West Side teacher, okay? But I actually haven't read Lord of the Rings either. I'm just trying to kind of throw it all out there. I watched the movies, endless amounts of walking. That seemed to be pretty much all that involved. But why is it that any one of those confessions make you feel slightly out of sync with your society? Why is it that making some of those confessions, we're literally talking about movies and TV shows, and yet in many contexts, be it your workplace, your university, or even your friendship group, simply admitting you haven't seen a movie gets the sort of social scorn poured at it that you would think we would be talking about something much more serious. So even our leisure of literally sitting passively watching a screen is now become a chore. It's now become something you've got to do. And if you don't do it, then what are you doing with your life? Jesus wasn't kidding when he said that we need to learn how to rest. Like he turns to his listeners in Matthew chapter 11, and he says, "Come with me, I'll show you how to take a real rest." And do you know what? I think we need to be shown how to do that. I think we need to be guided in the way of real rest. I was chatting just this week with our young adult coordinator, Tori, and he reminded me of a moment in C.S. Lewis's great book, The Screwtape Letters, where Lewis suggests that a great trick of the devil is to convince us that something needs a better justification than simply being that you like to do it. You see, in truth, the rest, the leisure, the joy of a walk, of a good book, of a coffee with a friend, that's intrinsically good. It has value just because you like doing it. It has value just because it's fun. And in doing these simple things that you can't say, well, the benefit is this or the benefit is that, or I produced this while doing it. Do you know what that reminds us? That we are recipients of God's grace. Taking a rest and producing nothing, not making, I'll try that with my teeth in, not making that a grade that you're supposed to have, not achieving that particular standard. If the thing you do doesn't do any of those things, it reminds you that you are created before you are a creator. And as a created person, God loves you. And he wants you to experience his grace. And he wants you to rest and play within that. Nimi Wariboko, in his book, The Pentecostal Principle, says, grace is characterized by play, no purpose at all. It is to exuberantly embrace the Holy Spirit as the spirit of play. Like just to live in the grace of play. Why are you doing that? Just because. Why do you do this particular thing on your day off? Because I'm made in God's image and he's okay with me not producing anything today. Why did you do that in your time that you had free? Because it was fun and I enjoyed it. And in enjoying things and in playing and in resting, I'm actually living out what it is to be created after God's heart. You see, you have immense power, as the famous brand tells you, to just do it. But perhaps the question of Sabbath is to realize that you also have immense power to just not do it. And that sometimes you shouldn't. See, because the power to not be commandeered by the need to produce all the time and instead live in the grace of rest. The difficulty of receiving this grace, however, is that, and why we struggle resting sometimes, is we're often in search of some sort of verdict on our lives. We like having measurable standards. We like having some sort of making the grade that we can reach up to. And then we know how we're doing in relation to how we should be doing. And we know how we're doing in relation to others that we think we should be doing the same as. And so we judge ourselves against others and also against the image of ourselves that we think we should be in our own head. The net result of this is that everything we do has to move us towards that image. And if it's not moving us towards that image of who we are, we consider it a waste. We consider it not a good use of our time. And so we want this verdict. Am I making the grade or not? Am I doing it well enough? Am I doing it right? And here's the problem as Christians. And Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, right towards the end of this profound chapter, Paul points something out to us about God and Jesus. If you're looking for judgment, if you're looking for a standard, you're not going to get it from him. Because he could judge you, but he chooses not to. He could keep you to a particular standard, but instead what you find is inseparable love of a God who is absolutely committed to pouring his grace on you if you'll let him. In fact, Paul in one of his other letters coins a phrase for a person, for that type of person who insists that despite what the gospel says, despite that the gospel desires to let you rest in the enoughness of Jesus, there's still someone out there who goes, no, I want a standard, I want a grade, and I want to try and make it. And Paul coins a phrase to help us with that. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4, it says, you who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. And here's the phrase, you have fallen away from grace. You see, grace doesn't have a to-do list. It's not a standard to attain or a grade to make. And that's why grace, present as it was in creation and present as it is now, gives us the space to rest. It's fascinating that in recent Christian history, the phrase fallen from grace is often used to define somebody who hasn't kept our rules and standards. We've actually turned the whole phrase around and mean something other than what Paul intended. What Paul means by this phrase is, if you want to replace the grace of God with rules and standards and grades, you can do that, but you've fallen from the grace of God's inseparable love, if that's the way you go. See, because rest allows you to see more clearly, to be fully human, to receive from God, and then to serve him better. And for that one day, we remind ourselves what he created for all 7 days. So there's this beautiful moment in Mark chapter 1. And this was a kind of moment that really motivated me to shape this particular series, where we find Jesus. Jesus is working late into the night. It's dark. Evening is kind of disappearing. And Jesus is healing people, and he's teaching, and he's putting everything back together again. And there's this beautiful text in Mark chapter 1 where it gives us a little insight into Jesus' rhythm of life. It says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, everyone is looking for you. Because there's always somebody looking for you. There's always still work to be done. There's always someone that wants to put something on your time and ask something of you. And Jesus replied, let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. So I think this passage summarizes something we're wrestling with in this series. Like, there is no end of things to be done. There's always things to do, and there'll always be people wanting you to do some of those things. But Jesus, he steps away from that, not because it's finished, not because it's complete, not because there's no more need, not because nobody's any longer demanding of him. He leaves because it's time for him to rest. And he finds that restful place, that prayerful place. But notice what happens when he's there. Notice what happens as a result of this restful, prayerful place. Jesus says, I'm not going back there. Because, and this perhaps sounds controversial to us in our image of Jesus, I'm not going back there because that's not what I'm here to do. Jesus says, actually, I have to go and do gospel work because that is why I have come. I wonder if our lack of clarity over our vocations, the calling of God that shaped us and what God's put us here for, I wonder if why we find it so hard to figure out what that is sometimes simply because we haven't learned to rest in God's grace. We haven't learned to take that space and just breathe and rest as God made us to. Marva Dawn, she always writes incredible things, but she says this in one of her works: one of the greatest gifts for my life as one who serves God is observing the Sabbath. Celebrating a holy day and living in God's rhythm for 6 days of work and one of rest is the best way I know to learn the sense of our call. The way in which God's kingdom reclaims us, revitalizes us, and renews us so that it can reign through us. Before we can engage in the practice of our call, we need to be captured afresh by grace, carried by it, and cared for. I'm really cautious of not trying to give you a purpose that makes rest beneficial here. But real rest does more than just revitalize our bodies. It repositions us within God's grace. And it helps us understand what we're here for. So whether you're stressed or bored, or perhaps you have too much money or not enough money, perhaps you're overworked or perhaps you're restless, figuring out what you're here for and what you have to give to the world, and then doing that is the most important response to God's restful grace that we can have. So let me pray for you this morning. I simply want to pray this: that may you learn, embrace, and keep the fourth commandment, that you shall rest. Not because it's a law, but because it's a gift of grace to rest, to play, to breathe, and enjoy. Because it's holy. And in that space, may God reclaim, revitalize, and renew you. And may you find purpose and calling, not to be enslaved to making the grade, but to serve God in his kingdom in the way you are skilled, able, and called to do. And may his grace and peace be on you as you rest and play. Amen and amen.